welcome to Round Robin. I'm your host, Robin McCormick with the City of Hampton. And today we have a really special treat for you. You are going to get to hear from one of Hampton's most famous citizens, someone who has done so much for the city, for the state of Virginia, and especially for our youth and for education. Dr. Delegate Mary T. Christian, welcome. I'm so thrilled that you're here.
Thank you so much for having me.
You have such a long career and so many stories to tell that I know we can't do this in, just one interview.
Right.
But I do want to grab you while you're here and talk to you about how you got started. You did not have necessarily an easy life.
No.
Tell us a little bit about your growing up.
Well, I grew up on Lincoln Street a few years ago, like 93.
Just a few.
And I grew up in a neighborhood at that time. We were sort of isolated in the African-American communities. Lincoln Street was really a great street. And we called it a great street, not because I lived on it, because we had our ministers living on the Lincoln Street, we had our teachers on there, we had our professionals on Lincoln Street, and just loving people. It was like a Lincoln Street community. In fact, that when I would be out, some of the older people say, "Oh, that's one of the Lincoln Street girls." So Lincoln Street held a certain distinction.
And just to set the stage for everybody, this community was formed by the contrabands, by the enslaved people who escaped, who came to Hampton early in the Civil War, and it was Lincoln Street, Union, Grant. I mean, it was a formal settlement after.
I was grown. That's why
right.
So the streets were named from. So
yeah, a very strong community grew up around it and around the churches and things like that. But it was a very segregated community, obviously.
Segregated. But it was a very loving community. It was a community as from the old tradition where everybody's child was everybody's child. And they had the authority to reprimand, to do anything they wanted to, and everybody was everybody's parents or guardians. Everybody was Uncle Jim or Cousin Sue or whatever. But that was the kind of community we grew up in. It was not a community with money and fame or fortune, but it was a lot of caring and a lot of love. And I think my parents, my mother was a homemaker, my dad was a businessman of sorts, but we had 5 children in the family, and we were, I would guess when one reporter asked me, said, "Well, how did you feel growing up in such a poor community?" And I responded to him, I said, "You know what? I never knew we were poor. I knew that I had to put some cardboard in my shoes when a hole got in them, but so did everybody else." So I said, I never felt poor. We didn't think of ourselves as a poor community.
But you were rich in things that...
Very much so.
Not that those things don't matter, but rich in other ways.
Rich in many ways, but during that time, during that area, during the time in the whole area from Armstead Avenue down to Court Street, there were black businesses. We had a pharmacy, we had a shoe shop, we had a barber shop, we had Lyle's filling station, we had Parker's Pharmacy. There were thriving black businesses during that time. So we didn't really have anything to want for at that time. We were a well-knit community. We had all the services we needed, and we were just happy people. I mean, I'm not saying that everything was fine in the whole world, but growing up, we did not know about the challenges that were beyond Lincoln Street. We knew what we had with our parents and our friends on Lincoln Street. And I'd like to just cite one instance, one story. During the time of high school, and I was selected to be the homecoming queen. Well, it was quite an honor to be homecoming queen, but here was I with holes in my shoes and everything. I came home and I said, "I'm homecoming queen." And the colors for Phoenix were maroon and gray. So my grandmother, whom I lived with, my aunt, the neighbor across the street was a seamstress. And she went to Candace and bought some material, the the burgundy blouse and gray skirt. She went to my other neighbor who did decorations. So she bought a little 25-cent hat, I guess, decorated with maroon and gray. And so she made this, and the other people bought me jewelry. It was a community. They just dressed me up. So it was, so I can remember when the parade, the homecoming parade came right by Lincoln Street, everybody on Lincoln Street applauded, and they all, they all had a part in dressing me up. That's just an example of the kind of camaraderie and feeling and caring that was available at that time.
And that has, I'm going to guess, shaped your life and how you feel about the community now, doesn't it?
Probably. Probably had a lot to do with caring and sharing and seeing little things that can be made to be bigger things. And if we really care, and I find that in working with children, many of them have hardships, and many of them maybe even impoverished, but when they see, they can feel when you care.
You know, this reminds me, there are a lot of studies now that show that what shapes children, what defines the children who face difficulties, whatever those are, whether it's economic or family or whether they succeed, tends to be resilience. It's this belief that they can succeed. It is a support from at least one adult in the family or in the close community that gives them the ability to keep going. And know that they can keep going.
I just saw, Lita, one of the areas, and I said, we got to add that to the Colored Women's Club. They had a grandparents academy. I just discovered that last week. And
what a great idea.
So they made, I said, that's a wonderful idea for children, you know, who don't have, you know, parents, grandparents, and so forth, and they're told what their objectives are. But one other thing that shaped things that I, that I have tried to do, one of the other components, the Barrett Peak Foundation, we have 3 major objectives. First is what we're working on now, the renovation of the Federation House historically, and to make it into a center. The second is that historic cemeteries, and that's one of the parts of our, one of the goals. And that stemmed from my childhood, because on Memorial Day, Christmas, Easter, all holidays, we would, my parents and people in the community would wash mayonnaise jars, and she'd put them out in the shed. And we wondered why we had to wash mayonnaise jars and put them out on the shed. But Memorial Day, they said, go get the mayonnaise jars. People in that time grew their own flowers, roses, chrysanthemums, tulips, all. And all the children would fill the mayonnaise jars. And the men would go a day or 2 before, make sure the cemeteries, they kept the cemeteries cut.
Right.
And on Memorial Day, all of the neighborhood, with our mayonnaise jars, the little ones would come, and I can remember my mom saying, go over to that gravesite, because she's too old to be out here today. Make sure you get some flowers on that. Every gravesite was covered with a mayonnaise jar and beautiful flowers. So that has sort of stayed with me. And when it came to light, when there was a poster down in Old North Hampton, had Pioneers of Hampton, and it had Mary Peak, one of the pioneers, the only person of color. And under it, it had her remains. She was teacher of freed slaves, her remains in the debris which was once Elmerton Cemetery. And that once was Elmerton Cemetery debris, and it was a forest like on Great Street. And that just stayed in my mind, and I could see us taking beautiful flowers and making that place so beautiful. And that's when we started the cleanup drive, cutting the trees and debris and getting that started. And that
So that was from your childhood there on Lincoln Street, where you honored the ancestors in your community, whether or not they were actually blood related to you, it was part of your life and heritage.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So you were homecoming queen at Phoenix. What happened after you graduated high school? What were your options?
Well, When I graduated at that time, because they considered me to be, pretty smart. It goes back.
Pretty smart, just a little bit, okay.
Just a little bit. But what happened when I went to elementary school, and I was able to read and write, so they skipped me. So at that time, you do acceleration if you could read and write. You went on 6 or 7. So I was a couple of grades ahead of myself.
So when you graduated, you were how old?
I was still too young.
Okay.
And so that was not an advantage. And so I sort of fell in love, and I'm a high school football player and so forth. We married and had 2 kids, and he was in the service, but it didn't work out. Neither of us was young, old enough to know what was happening. So anyway, we were divorced. So I had 2 children, and I lived with my parents. And that's when I started working. I worked at the theater. I worked at Langley Field in the cafeteria. And then after I went to the cafeteria, I got a job in the laundry at Hampton, at the time, Hampton Institute. So I was working at Hampton Institute during the time when the professors would come to the laundry to get their clothes. And there was one person, Miss Winston, would always drag me up. Every time a professor would come in, she would drag me up. This little girl, I was the youngest, of course, in there. So I was always this little girl.
A little girl with 2 kids of your own.
2 kids of my own, but
still
a little girl.
very young, yeah.
And they'd drive me up. She'd always, this little girl, she is so smart. She does not belong to be in the laundry, and I want you all to do something to help her, to get her out of this laundry. She should be in school. And that kept going to Mr. William Mason Cooper, who was the first African-American on the school board, and also Cooper School is named after him, was registrar of Hampton. And you don't want to know that whole story because it is so long, but that's how I got started. I worked in the laundry, and because I was able to iron the shirts and also do some typing at the laundry, I took typing courses during my lunch hour so that I could learn how to type, and I did pretty well. So he hired me to be his secretary. I went there to fill in because his secretary was on vacation.
Okay.
And Miss Winston had worried him to death about me. So I was his secretary.
You had your champions, that's good.
So I went in to be his secretary. And as other officials took their vacation, they shifted me from one secretarial post to the other. And then I got to be known all through as the typist, and I was pretty good in typing. And so then it was so very, I guess he was perceptive. He said, you know what, you need to be more than, I said, well, I want to get a job as a typist, so I just want to learn how to type. He said, but you can do more than that. And he said, I'm going to send you to Dr. Eva C. Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell was a legend. She was the head of teacher education.
Oh, okay.
And that's when I started that career. All of those could be a separate story. But I mean, it goes back to how my childhood affected each of these areas and phases of my life.
So you were working full-time, learned typing on your lunch hour.
Yes.
And then moved through some secretary roles, and people could tell that you could do more. You're still working full-time and raising 2 kids.
Yes.
And then you started taking classes.
The time was, I took courses, and I'd go to work at 6 a.m. in the morning. I'd work from 6 to 8 in the office, and then I'd do classes. When it came time for student teaching, you had to have a full day. So they were able to get me a UNCF scholarship. So that paid for my tuition and student teaching. And that's when I started student teaching, graduated, and started teaching in the Hampton Public Schools at Aberdeen School. So that was my professional beginning.
Wow. So that sort of launched you. Did you ever stop and think, I'm not ready for this? Did you stop and think, I should do this faster? I know I can do this. I mean,
it was a mixture of thoughts. some of the times when I, things, but still, again, I was able to have a family that was supportive, an older sister who was like my mother. I mean, she was a matriarch of the family, a lot of family support and friend support. And I've sort of always had that drive to do more, and I wanted to do more because people had done so much for me. I always felt like I'm not doing enough to pay back the greatness and the goodness and the help people have given to me. And I think that has motivated me because I could not have done it. As I say, I've been standing on the shoulders of many, including my
and many
parents.
have been standing on your shoulders too. So you've helped others along. And you didn't stop. So you get a decent job, you can support your family, but you kept going. You took additional classes.
Yes.
And got your master's and then PhD.
Yes, and that was, of course, Dr. Eva C. Mitchell, who was my mentor. And when she came to me and at Aberdeen School and said, you know what, you should go on and you should get your master's, because during that time, the state paid African Americans to go out of state, so that we wouldn't go to the University of Virginia, to the white university.
Right.
Oh yes, we could not go to the white universities. They paid everything, even airfare, tuition, meals. Didn't even have to send receipts, just go. So that's how I got to Columbia University, because it was paid for by the state. And then when she came to me and she said, I've been here all these years and I'm going to retire. And it would do my heart good if one of York calls her girls, if one of my girls could take my place. And at that time, I had been offered a job in the public schools. I had a master's in speech and drama. And I had this job offer to be speech therapist for the Hampton schools, double the salary that I would get at Hampton. And so I said, well, Dr. Mitchell, I have a job offer. She said, but all the girls that I have come through, I sure would love it. I can understand. And I went home and I thought about it. I said, well, I need the money for my kids. And I said, but had it not been for her, I wouldn't have had this. So I told her yes. And that's when I went to Hampton as an instructor in the Department of Elementary Education, later became the director of the department, later became director of the division, and dean of the School of Education. So I mean, I always say I came from the laundry to the secretary, to the chair, to the dean. And now I'm Professor Emeritus at Hampton University.
And what I hear you saying there is, again, this gets back to your Lincoln Street background. You had something that would have benefited you and your family personally a lot more at the time, but you understood the needs of people who had helped you and your ability to help them and the bigger community needs, and put those ahead of your own personal gain.
Absolutely. And while I was at Hampton, during the time I went to a school board meeting, and the report was that 32 children had failed kindergarten. And I sat there, I said, kindergarten, can you just imagine
how does a child
coming to school bright and to say you failed? So I went to school system, Nedra Harkavy at the time. I said, Nedra, we cannot have those children to fail. I said, just starting. She said, well, they didn't pass their tests. I said, well, those children just weren't able to pass tests, but we can't. I said, how about maybe some kind of bridge to bridge them over? She said, okay, how about a bridge program? So that started the bridge program. The children would move, but they would have the same level of instruction, but they did not know they had failed. So I was so great. Then I started thinking, I said, I wonder, let me see about those children. And then when I did a little research, I found that they were all in Pine Chapel. That was a low-income project. And I was teaching, so I had my juniors. I said, I'm going to give you a project. First, I wrote a course that said field experience in underprivileged areas. And I said, I'm going to give you your project. What you make from this project will be your grade. And I carried them over to Pine Chapel, and it was the model home that they had for the project, which was deserted. They said, well, this is a deserted old house, but you're welcome to it. So I put my students there. I say, it's all yours. They went to carpet places and got remnants of carpeted, wove it all together. They painted the place and put sesame characters. It looked like a Montessori learning center. And they got so involved in it. They were so, they wouldn't let me come. They said, no, you know, when I went there, I was so surprised, and that was their project. Now, when we started then tutoring the children, because when I found out that's where these 32, it was the beginning of busing, that's where these children came from that had failed. So my students tutored them, and their parents would come and wait for them. So the secondary majors found out that they hadn't completed high school. So they tutored the parents
also.
to get the GED. 3 of those, 11 of them got the GEDs, 3 became teachers. So, I mean, it was so rewarding that it all came from this experience, and it all came from, you know, and so the second semester, when I didn't have them in the class, and I said, well, I can't give you a grade. They said, we don't want a grade, we just want to volunteer. And so I said, the intrinsic benefit. And so that started it all. And so the children, 3 years later, some of them were on honor roll.
That's amazing.
It was amazing.
So
and
your sphere is growing
growing.
from your Lincoln Street
But you have to type on my Lincoln Street.
Aberdeen
Yeah.
to Hampton Institute, then to the community.
To the community.
Is this the
especially
point at
Pine
which
Chapel.
you decided you should be on the school board?
Well, that was Mr. William Mason Cooper also, because he was on the school board during that time, and Dr. William Robinson, who was head of the division when Mr. Cooper passed. At that time, we didn't have to be elected, it was appointed.
It was appointed.
So they did petitions to the school board, you know, appointing, asking petitions in my behalf. And that's how I became president of the school board.
And now this is all during, and you know, desegregation was, some people might point to a time when it happened, but it was actually a very long process.
Yes, absolutely. But you know, Hampton, Hunter Andrews was chair of the school board at that time. But Hampton was one of the few communities, if not the only, in the state of Virginia. Schools closed, people had rallies, people had protests and so forth, you know, with the desegregation. But Hampton was one of the only places that desegregation came without incident. And Mr. Hunter Andrews, as he was, he's a personality within himself.
Yes, I remember.
But he guided that process, and I mean, we had some growing problems, but in terms of having, you know, the big rallies and protests, Hampton desegregated without incident.
And didn't close the schools.
It did not close the schools.
What was your role in that? Where were you while that was going on?
Well, that would be another whole story.
Oh, I know. Well, we'll schedule you to come back and talk more about particular things.
Yeah, we'll talk about the little incidental kinds of things. But I really wanted to bring in my involvement in Pine Chapel during the time when the Honorable Richard Bagley was in the General Assembly, and he decided to come out of the General Assembly to run for governor. And I was busy in the community trying to get other people. That was one of my other things, getting them on. We got the first African-American mayor on city council, so I'm in the background getting people on.
But you were in the background,
I was that's where I wanted to stay, too.
Stay there.
And they came to me and said, you know, you can win this. I said, no, I'm an organizer. I'm not a politician. No, the answer is no.
Yeah, that didn't last.
They stayed there till 1 o'clock that morning to persuade me to run for office to be delegate. And that would be another total story.
I would love to talk about that.
The one thing I wanted to share, when I ran and it could be a story to tell you what happened when I ran and how I happened to run as an independent. But Pine Chapel, that I had my students there, they got 1,100 people ready. They came, oh, Dr. Christian's gonna run. Those people were my biggest supporters. They got everybody almost in Pine Chapel registered to vote. They had their dinners and soul food on Fridays to donate money to the campaign. But it just shows you how when you give, it comes back in ways you never would have even expected.
Right, something you didn't even plan on ever doing, and then all of a sudden.
All of a sudden it did. But I had to bring that in because of the connection with Pine Chapel and how sometimes we underestimate grassroots populations.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, they
take
know
for
what they want
granted
for
or
their
think,
children, and they knew I was there when they needed me, and they just came. Just came. You know, one of my biggest part of my campaign.
So now your sphere is the whole state, right?
Yes.
What was it like walking into the Capitol, the state, Virginia, former capital of the Confederacy?
The fabulous Confederacy. Looking back again, walking in, and you know, I thought about my parents and my came back with Lincoln Street, you know, and I was blessed with not only a loving family, but a Christian family. And I just stopped at the Capitol and I just prayed a short prayer. And I said, thank you, God, for blessing me. Maybe now I can even do more for my people and for all the people. And I just felt, you know, but I felt at peace, you know, and I have been in so many rough places that the General Assembly, I mean, I had my little, you know, tremors here and there with all of this, but I never felt intimidated because I had been through some rough places, and on the school board I've been through some tough issues and I'd had to face those things, and I think God prepared me in ways that I didn't know what I was being prepared for. So when I got to the General Assembly, and then, you know, I was there as an independent, only two in the whole, black, female, and independent, so it was another hurdle.
You were really on the outside.
On the outside. Lacey Putney was the one independent who was in the General Assembly, and I became the other independent for the first term.
That didn't last too long. What did it feel like, though, being a part of that body, but in some ways, they didn't really want you to be a part, would be my guess. Partly party, partly gender, partly race.
Yes, that's just
partly, they don't like newbies anyway.
Yeah,
you know, it's a seniority kind of place.
But you know, I because I was an independent, I was neither a Democrat nor a Republican. And I could not join the Democratic caucus because I was an independent and I would have to run again as a Democrat. So they didn't place me with the Democrats and they didn't place me in the Republicans. So here I was right in the middle, Republican side of it. So some of my best friends got to be Republicans because they were the ones that took me in until...
You were the original bipartisan,
I was a really
weren't you?
bipartisan, you know, when it came to that. But at that time, General Assembly, even though we had different parties, it was not the divisiveness and the kind of mean and hateness as it is today.
Yeah,
It wasn't that there. We had different issues and different values, different traditions, but we still managed to work together. I remember Glenn Oda, who's now at Fort Monroe, was one of my colleagues, and we are best of friends, you know.
Well, I do get the feeling that there was a time when people found common ground.
Yes.
Or at least tried to find common ground, or could agree on one part of an issue.
And I tried to go to everybody, you know, introduce myself and told them I would hope that they would share with me as I was learning and everything. In one meeting that I went to and I voted, and I said, Mr. Chairman, I think I would like to, you must add 2 more votes. And he said, Delegate Christian, what do you mean? I said, well, I voted for myself, but I want to vote for being a black woman. I want to vote for being African American. I want to vote for being an African American woman, that's your agenda, and all the rest were lawyers. And I want another vote for being an educator. So you give me 3 votes.
Count me more.
Count me 3 times.
Well, you made quite a difference up there, and I know it took a while. Is it fair to say that education, children, families have remained your biggest issue? I know you have a lot of issues.
But you know, they did not put me on education.
You don't get to pick for a while, do you?
You didn't get to pick. And I was so disappointed, you know, that I said, I can't believe this. You know, all these lawyers and corporate executives on education that couldn't, and that
Thinking
would be
they know something about education.
But that would be another story. And I was on labor and commerce, but I found that where I was, I was able to make a difference, because I was able to see things that were going on, the discrimination and so forth. And then I was one of the first African Americans to be on appropriations.
That is important. Where the money is spent is where the priorities are.
3 of us. And that's where we could able to see the discrepancy with the universities, with their funds, and each of them is another story. But appropriation rules committee, so I came in without any affiliation and ended up being on the rules and appropriations,
2 of the most powerful committees.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And I was able to do more for Hampton. Airspace Museum, the Hampton University Museum, the City of Hampton TANF program, all of those things.
Hampton had a powerful coalition in Richmond at that time.
Yes.
You all were amazing. Well, I would be able to talk to you for hours,
I know.
but I think that's too much for now. So if it's okay with you, we'll stop this, but I would love to have you come back and
I would like to tell some of the little
more
stories.
Things. I would too.
Every phase of my life has a story. And every time I go back to a story, you know, and tell them the story. But the little stories made me where I was, what I was able to do. And it's always been, what can I do? What can I do?
Not what can I be, not who can I, you know, how can I put myself forward? It's always been, what can I do
what can I do? What can I do? God has been such a blessing to me. How can I be a blessing?
Is that the message that you would have for people today, that you want people to remember and learn from?
Yes. Yes.
I believe that.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's wonderful. And thank you all for watching. I hope you have an appreciation for how much Dr. Christian has done for our community, for our state, for Hampton, for our children and our families, and we'll want to come back and hear more stories from her. Thank you.